In my short transition from moviegoer to movie critic, I've learned a lot about the rights and wrongs, the ups and downs, the victories and the failures, the bumps and the blunders regarding some of the industry's biggest draws and biggest turnaways. Today is a day that I never thought I was going to be able to get around to, but it's been a long time coming. We've already proven that there's an art to making bad films, but even in this day and age, people often forget that, like a wise person once said, there's no such thing as bad publicity. And you can bet there's an art to tastelessness as well. I know we as a species have seen plenty of bad films before, but I never fully grasped the hold of what made those films stand out against the films that are deemed failures, but are still enjoyed today by people all over the world, regardless of their quality. So today, I plan to take a look at films often considered the worst of the worst, and find out for myself the individual aspects that make those feature films so bad they're good, while dissecting past 3 well-known contributions to movies off the top of my head: acting, cinematography or editing, and plot structure. I decided to go through not one, but 3 less obvious choices when dissecting this topic: Battlefield Earth, Birdemic Shock and Terror, and Freddy Got Fingered, all of which were negatively received when released, but slowly gained cult classic status afterwards. Compared to aspects that I'm gonna get into later on, acting has become one of, if not the most noticeable aspect in identifying the kind of movie that the audience will be stuck in, because depending on the direction given, it can either be really awkward or just a full-on dumpster fire. Battlefield Earth is a brilliant example of this. The universally trashed film won 9 out of 10 Raspberry Awards and won an award for Worst Movie of the Decade in 2010 for basically getting every film aspect under the sun wrong, including packing some of the most memorably laughable chunks of dialogue one could ever hear in a sci-fi film thanks to incredibly silly and uneven performances. In the What Makes a Movie So Bad It's Good Instead of Just Bad article, Charlie Jan Anders states, "It's dialogue like,
while you were still learning how to spell your name, I was being trained to conquer galaxies."
That makes Battlefield Earth such a source of endless joy. A regular bad movie can have banal dialogue, but a good bad movie tends to have dialogue that would make George Lucas look like Harold Pinter. For a film that was endlessly mocked for decades, the amount of times that the film's dialogue was quoted daily speaks to some indication how John Travolta's performance heightened the status of a movie similar to Battlefield Earth. Whether it be unintentional or not, Travolta is hamming it up to 11, while Barry Pepper and Forrest Whitaker, for example, are mostly playing it straight. And I say mostly since even when they do, it still comes off looking hilarious because of what the two have to work with. Yes, one could say that the cast in general is more restrained in how over the top they are, but that within itself is still tragically hilarious. As for the 2010 independent horror film, Birdemic Shock and Terror, this is odd, to say the least. For an independent horror film, it proved itself as not scary, crudely unfunny, and severely illogical, especially with the acting that comes off as uniformly terrible, but also strangely watchable. Now, Alan Braw and Whitney Moore are not easy on the eyes and ears, regardless of any scene that they're in.
What do you like to do for fun?
Watch football, especially the 49ers. Also, part-time Eagles fan.
Yeah, it was nice meeting you. Look at these birds. What the hell they died
Stop!
like
Don't touch it. It may be infectious.
I'm going out there to save them.
Don't go. If you go out there, you'll die. They're dead already.
What? $100? That's outrageous.
But to give them credit, they're never boring because of just how unnatural the performances are. It's like you're watching a bunch of robots that are programmed to walk to this place, do that, and then rinse and repeat. They don't even give any motivation for their actions either. Because of this, every other scene, yes, even the ones that are boring, are still rather fascinating. And then there's the infamous Freddy Got Fingered, who didn't even try to hide the varying degrees of acting it displayed, especially with the cast that Tom Green got, because it was all over the place, which would probably mask the absurdity that already engulfs the movie. But in all seriousness though, everybody in this movie was way too good for what they were given. Anthony Michael Hall was obviously phoning it in, Harlan Williams did next to nothing, Julie Haggerty and Eddie K. Thomas are completely forgettable, Marissa Coughlin's awkward shrivel does succeed in making her weird character one of the few memorable, if not polarizing, love interests in cinema history, and Drew Barrymore and Rip Torn are so ridiculously over the top every time they're on screen, it's legitimately the only few times the movie actually inherits a genuine laugh.
Get out of my goddamn scuba gear, you imbecile!
Seeing how basically everyone is off and how they deliver their lines makes it another intriguing guessing game on who will play it straight, who will go overboard, and whether or not the end result is going to see somebody laughing out of their seat. For one's vision for a movie to become a reality, having a steady balance on how it needs to be shot and put together is just as important compared to the story writers and directors choose to tell. Most of the time, they need to make sure that vision is executed in the way they plan to envision it, but when technical aspects do fail them, the experience is not bound to be pretty. Whether it comes down to lack of experience or incompetence, it normally results in a subpar, if not awful, project, which is exactly what had befallen Birdemic. As Nathan Raw brought to our attention in his What Makes a Movie So Bad That It's Good article, the camera work, lighting, and sound editing is lower in quality than those of the budgetless films I made in college. The hilariously awful looking CG on the birds and the way they dive bomb and explode on impact was the most iconic thing about the film. While nowhere near the easiest job in the world, the amount of laziness on display for the camera work and editing in Birdemic had become utterly jaw-dropping, even for the year 2010. I mean, seriously, just look at this!
Open the door.
Rendered CGI eagles and vultures have been crudely plastered onto the screen, spitting acid and exploding with a plane dive sound effect and unrealistic smoke that follows suit, while technical glitches buffer the camera or the audio every few seconds. Either it's too loud, too quiet, repetitive, or inconsistent for a collective group of people to spare, but something about the poor quality also adds a new comedic value to the experience, because you never quite know exactly what you're going to get either in that moment or what to come next. The same could be said for Battlefield Earth. Similar to Birdemic, its technical abnormalities are front and center. Outside of too much slow-mo and close-ups, the first thing that many people are going to notice is how the film spent the majority of its time having the camera tilted at a Dutch angle. And this is for about 95% of the movie, trying to capture the feel of a comic book completely unaware of the fact that what works in one medium does not necessarily work in another. Peter Clover discussed this issue very nicely in his Big Bads article, stating, "When used effectively, the Dutch angle can be a very effective filmmaking tool, but just about 90% of the shots in Battlefield Earth utilize Dutch angles for reasons still unknown. In order for a Dutch angle to serve its purpose, it needs to be employed sparingly. No sane person could describe the Dutch angles in this movie as sparingly, as the tilted frame makes it look like someone accidentally bumped the camera and nobody noticed until editing. It doesn't really look any better no matter how many times you do try and look at it. It all gets more ridiculous during the action sequences when the positioning and tilt of the camera prohibit the viewer from gaining any sense of what's even happening in the frame. And that's not even going into the detail about the lengths that this film went to avoid an R rating. Most of the violence is done off screen, there's barely any blood anywhere, and there are some instances where the Dutch angle was just gone with no explanation or leeway whatsoever. The level of inconsistency is staggering. Compared to the previous two, Freddy Got Fingered's editing is very tame in comparison, but many of his editing issues are very subtle blink and you'll miss it moments that once you do catch them, you can't unsee them. Check out the bathroom scene, where if you pay super close attention, you can tell where some shots contradict one another or just drift alongside the end of the set. This right here, Gord's father opens the door with his left arm, but then the next shot is with his right arm. And then there's the very end of the scene where he squeezes past the camera and leaves a shadow over it. Heck, Green couldn't even properly send the 1 week later caption close to the end of the movie. And any other film, I believe that was a mistake, but given how bizarre random the film already is, I'm convinced he did that on purpose just to make everything in this film feel a little off. Plot structure can be initially tricky to nail. Watching a bad movie intended to be taken seriously brings about a lot of aspects to what's wrong and what isn't, given that sometimes they have the tendency to drone off on the audience's attention span. But other times, they single-handedly elevate an endurance test into quite an unremarkable experience for the right person with a different expectation in mind. The plot structure behind all three of these movies is so in-depth and so out there that it's arguable that anyone could enjoy for one reason or the other, given the right perspective. And having the right perspective in films like these are exactly what Jared Barho from the channel Wisecrack on YouTube discussed when he uploaded Why Bad Films Are Better Than You Think, taking his turn to elaborate on that with this statement.
In explicitly good, artful films like 2001, we go to the movies and silently, reverently consume the film and then say, wow, when we leave. In contrast, Wild in the Streets is blatantly not a masterpiece of American filmmaking, but you will have a fun, irreverent time watching it, and there's value in that.
While a good movie requires you to think or be immersed into the action as seriously as they expect you to, films such as these earn their cult status by separating themselves from reality as far as possible and just rolling with whatever they saw fit. If you were to look at Birdemic as a horror movie, the results would vary much differently if you were to view the same film as a comedy, because only then would you experience be more subtly appropriate for the madness you're going to watch unfold. It has special effects ripped out of a Windows screensaver that are so unconvincing they mock the phrase itself, acting so painfully bad as a tad bit more entertaining, and a storyline that packs some of the most ham-fisted moralistic messaging ever seen in any movie about global warming, causing these acid-spitting birds to attack everywhere. Now, I would say that, but the film itself doesn't even seem to be aware of what its own message is about, to the point where I'm convinced this is just a joke without a setup or a payoff. But it's one we can laugh at regardless. The same could be said for Battlefield Earth. For the actual plot at hand, once you delve deep into it, is about as dumb as the characters and the costumes. Not only does it not make any sense thanks to the cycle's endless stupidity, but even if that wasn't the case, there are numerous plot holes galore here. The aliens have weaknesses that make even the non-rocket scientists in the audience wonder, how did these guys survive long enough to conquer anyone? How long would certain things like books, computer-dependent machinery, or combustion engines last and still be of any use to anyone in the year 3000? Too many things you see in this movie are simply beyond belief. Science fiction or otherwise, the point is that the basic story could have been told without any of these ridiculous questions bugging the viewer. I understand the suspension of disbelief is a requirement of sci-fi fans, but for Battlefield Earth, there was no limit to just what was necessary to tell the story they tried to tell. All of which makes the fact that they took everything so seriously all the more ridiculous. Freddy Got Fingered is also more or less the same, but not because it tries, however. The pure bewilderment and unintentional stupidity I experienced watching Freddy Got Fingered was a feeling that I rarely experience. Most of it comes from the plot structure's radical sense of direction, which in turn resulted in a lot of head-scratching moments. All of which makes what John Dick and Matt Johnson elaborated in their journal Appreciating Bad Art hit closer to home. They said, "It is possible to maintain one inherent quality, its irrelevancy, and one typical effect, its capability of producing bewilderment. It's also helpful to think of the bizarre as weird, strange, and fantastic. The bizarreness in these works is intentional. The bizarreness in good bad art is not intentional. Good bad art is bizarre in a way that sets it apart from purposely placed bizarreness." Recognizing the many layers that comprise a bad film as opposed to a good film has not necessarily evolved into a difficult task, but Freddy Got Fingered is one of the many films in which those lines get blurred. The film gives off the impression of being a run-of-the-mill bad comedy, but not only is it too dumb to know how to achieve that feat, it's also way too self-aware of its hokey nature to just be run-of-the-mill. And yet, it still created something truly unforgettable by glorifying itself out of pretending that it knows that. The film's complete inability to come up with anything coherently sound while also giving small insight about the writer-director's hard-to-stomach transgressive nature will undoubtedly come off as a selling point for some audiences, while others will remain perplexed. Every decision or choice made leaves the audience in such a mind-numbing state of uncertainty and bewilderment. You're left with no other alternative but to laugh. It's widely regarded to be its secret genius. In terms of actual plot structure, Battlefield Earth is the closest one of these three that has an exposition, a rising action, climax, fallen action, and a resolution, but the path that it has to take to get there is so laughably absurd and uneventful that it barely feels like much is even happening. Birdemic cuts out any rising or falling action, and the absence of any climax leaves the film randomly spinning its wheels for an hour and 45 minutes straight. The entire thing is almost completely non-existent in Freddy Got Fingered. The level of insulting idiocy it displays by irritating its audience in the stupidest of ways is so grand, it often feels more or less like one big giant prank. There's hardly any payoff or setup to anything, and barely anything it shows has much to do with the mere 20 minutes of plot that it actually has. Sometimes there's a film that comes along that just completely boggles the mind. You cannot believe that the thing exists. But there it is, paddling its arms forward like a Special Olympics finalist. In the world of cinema, we have taken 3 steps forward and 5 steps back countless times. But these movies here, they will forever stand the test of time, proving that just when you think you can't get any worse, or campier, or lazier, or more unintentionally hilarious, odds are it can. The details, as explained by Phil Christman in his article The Cinema of Inadvertence, stated the following. Bad film's meanings expand, swallowing the meanings of its good parent text. Eventually, the categories good and bad, original and derivative, begin to seem inadequate, boxes in which to hide powerful objects. The love of bad movies has made me more observant and more tolerant of the little inadversities that crop up even in the greatest of works. Hollywood can always stoop to a new low, and while some moviegoers find that sad, others will find comfort in these feature films considered the inescapable black holes of all cinema, because what makes the movie so bad it's good goes back to just how much we haven't seen before, and just how intriguingly bad they become. Lots of these big budget or small budget feature films that earn the mantra of being called that pose more questions than answers, and those questions are ones that we don't want to be answered because it will only ruin the mystique behind what made them so entertaining to begin with. The ability to be engrossed in what's presented to us in movies requires us to submit to an illusion. And so when the illusion is done wrong, but in a bizarre or strange way, it still captures our attention. And why mess with that?